Imagine waking up one day with the unmistakable sensation that something inside you, something ancient, feral and wordless, has been quietly steering your life when you weren't looking. Not a demon, not a trauma, not some clinical diagnosis, but something far more subtle and far more familiar. A feeling you've mistaken for truth, or maybe even for yourself. Imagine you open your eyes, and before your conscious mind fully boots up, strange heaviness settles into your chest. Not sadness, not fear. Something stranger, something that almost feels comfortable. A familiar ache, like an old friend who knows exactly how to sit inside your ribs without being noticed. And then, a question one you never dare ask. In the back of your skull, why does discomfort feel so natural? Why does suffering feel so much like home? You've spent your whole life trying to avoid pain, haven't you? Every decision, every reassurance, every distraction, every late-night thought spiraling in circles like exhausted birds. All of it meant to escape suffering. Yet if you dared to look closer than you've ever allowed yourself, you would see a horrifying contradiction. For something you claim to hate, you return to suffering with unnerving devotion. Not consciously, not intentionally, but inevitably. Look at the patterns you've repeated. The relationships you stayed in long after they hollowed you out. The habits you swore you'd break. The thoughts you rehearse every night as if preparing for a performance no one else will ever see. Look closely enough, and you'll notice a quiet truth. There are wounds you protect more fiercely than your dreams. There are fears you trust more than hope. Why? Why would a human being cling to the very experiences that imprison them? What kind of creature runs back into the burning house it fought so hard to escape? What kind of mind chooses the familiar over the freeing? And what if this pattern isn't a flaw, but a blueprint, one you never knew you were following? Somewhere within you lies a question that has haunted thinkers, mystics, and psychologists for centuries, hidden beneath layers of culture, memory, and instinct. Are we addicted to suffering? And if so, who taught us to crave our own pain? Maybe it began the first time you were comforted for crying, learning without words that suffering brings connection. Maybe it began the first time you disappointed someone and felt the heat of shame. You learned that suffering keeps you obedient. Maybe it began the first time you watched adults drown in their own misery and call it normal life, and you internalized their despair like a family tradition. Or maybe it's deeper than memory. Maybe it's woven into the architecture of your psyche, a quiet inheritance passed down through millennia of human struggle. Maybe the mind is not designed for peace, but for survival, and suffering, ironically, is the one state your nervous system is expertly trained to navigate. But even if all that is true, another truth sits in the center of this mystery, waiting like a spark in dry grass. If suffering feels like home, what does that make joy? A visitor? A stranger? An intruder you politely entertain but never allow to stay? And if that's the case, what happens to a life built around a craving you never realized you had? You feel it, don't you? The subtle tension in the air, the quiet burn of recognition. A part of you already suspects there is something here, something that explains the cycles you can't break, choices you don't understand, the dreams you postpone until they wither. But we're not ready to answer anything yet. Not here. Not in the opening moments of this unraveling. Instead, let the questions simmer. What if your suffering is not an accident, but an identity your mind refuses to surrender? What if the pain you carry is not just a burden, but a compass? What if the thing you've been trying to escape all your life is the very thing you unconsciously seek? These are not easy questions. They're the kind that rearrange you, the kind that unsettles the quiet rooms inside your mind, the kind that turns your thoughts into battlegrounds. But before anything can be healed, before anything can be transformed, there must be illumination. And illumination begins by stepping into darkness, willingly as open, breath steady, heart trembling but curious. Because the truth is this: you cannot break free from what you do not understand. You cannot escape a pattern you cannot see. You cannot rebel against a cage you've mistaken for shelter. So let us walk deeper. Let us peel back the layers. let us explore how suffering infiltrated the core, your identity psychologically, philosophically, and culturally, without you ever noticing. What lies beneath this addiction is older and more intricate than you think, and everything begins. You walk deeper into the labyrinth walls, shaped not of stone, but of memory, instinct, and inherited fear. The air thickens, not with danger, but with recognition. There's a strange, unsettling familiarity here, as if you are approaching a truth that has lived in your shadow long before you ever had language to describe it. Because the hidden problem, the real reason suffering clings to you like a second skin, didn't begin in a single moment of trauma. It didn't start with heartbreak, failure, or disappointment. Those were merely the triggers, the surface-level eruptions of something far older. No, the root lies deeper, in a place where psychology meets philosophy, where instinct meets identity, where the ancient human mind bargains with existence itself. And the truth is this: suffering gives you a sense of self. Carl Jung once wrote that people would rather cling to the worst parts of themselves, what he called the shadow, than confront the terrifying possibility of change. He believed that humans unconsciously bind themselves to their suffering because it provides the illusion of solidity. If you know your pain, you know yourself. If you hold on to your wounds, at least you understand their edges. But to surrender suffering, to step into an identity not molded by hurt, that requires facing the unknown, and the human psyche has always feared the unknown more than pain. The mind, in its primitive genius, mistakes familiarity for safety. Joy is unpredictable. Peace is fragile. Hope can be betrayed. But suffering is loyal. It's always there when everything else falls away. It becomes a ritual, a rhythm, a dark companion that never leaves. In a world overflowing with uncertainty, suffering becomes something like stability. But there is another layer, one more philosophical, more existential, and more frightening. Nietzsche argued that humans are not inherently afraid of suffering. They are afraid of suffering without meaning. When life feels chaotic or directionless, the psyche seeks to attach to whatever gives it structure. And suffering, ironically, can be the easiest structure to maintain. It becomes a twisted form of meaning-making, a way to tell yourself, I am this. This is my story. This is why I hurt. And once suffering becomes meaningful, it becomes addictive. Schopenhauer went further, suggesting that the human condition is defined by an endless cycle of desire and dissatisfaction. According to him, peace is not our default state. Trustlessness is. The moment the mind finds calm, it begins searching for the next source of discomfort. Not because it wants misery, but because misery feels like motion, and motion feels like being alive. Aldous Huxley warned that humans grow attached to their mental prisons because they forget they are trapped. They decorate the walls, they rationalize the bars, they convince themselves that the narrowness is normal, even virtuous. They begin to fear freedom, because freedom requires responsibility, and responsibility requires consciousness. So what does this mean for you? It means your addiction to suffering is not a flaw, it is not a weakness, it is not some personal failure of willpower. It is the natural result of a psychological and philosophical inheritance no one ever warned you about. From the moment you were a child, your mind learned that suffering is currency. Cry, and someone comes to soothe you. Struggle, and someone may help you. Fail, and at least no one expects anything more from you. Somewhere along the path of your development, you learned quietly. Unconsciously, that pain draws attention, care, validation, or escape. Suffering became a language you spoke fluently long before you understood its grammar, and the world reinforced it. Society is obsessed with struggle. Entire cultures romanticize pain as proof of character. People wear suffering like a badge of authenticity. I've been through hell, so I deserve respect. Think about how we praise overwork, burnout, emotional repression, and self-sacrifice. We celebrate those who endure, those who push through, those who never give up regardless of the cost. This social mythology seeps into your bones until suffering feels noble, righteous, even morally superior. But beneath all of this lies the most dangerous illusion. Suffering creates identity, but only the illusion of a stable one. Jean-Paul Sartre believed that humans create themselves through choices, but when people fear the weight of that freedom, they anchor themselves to a fixed identity, often one shaped by suffering. Because if your suffering defines you, then you never have to face the terrifying possibility that you can redefine yourself at any moment. It is easier to say, "I am broken," than to ask, "Who am I without my brokenness?" It is easier to cling to pain than to risk the vulnerability of healing, and so the addiction forms. Not because you love suffering, but because suffering gives you. Sertanidin is the cage, You walk its perimeter with such regularity that the path becomes smooth beneath your feet. You begin to mistake the grooves you've carved for destiny, when in truth, they are simply a repetition. But here's where the psychological roots twist into something even darker. Your brain literally adapts to suffering. Neural pathways strengthen around the emotions you repeat most often. If pain is familiar, your brain will default to it. If anxiety is routine, your mind will seek it. If self-doubt is constant, your thoughts will spiral toward it with mechanical precision. What begins as emotional conditioning becomes neurological architecture. What begins as a story becomes a biological habit. This is the hidden problem. This is the force that shapes your life without your awareness. This is the machinery beneath your suffering, a machinery you never built consciously, yet one that dictates your emotions, decisions, relationships, and identity. But you still haven't seen the whole picture. Not yet, because the roots are only the beginning. What grows from them? What spreads into every corner of your life? Far the consequences you never realized you were living under. And once you see those consequences clearly, everything changes. You step into the next chamber of the labyrinth, and something shifts. The air feels colder, sharper, like a truth waiting to cut you open. Because once you understand the roots of your attachment to suffering, the next realization arrives with brutal clarity. Your addiction to suffering is not passive. It has shaped everything. Not just your emotions, not just your habits, everything. Your relationships, your self-worth, your ambitions, your perception of the world. Even the way you interpret silence, stillness, and love. The consequences are not dramatic explosions or catastrophic events. They are far more insidious. They creep into your life like fog, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but thick enough to blind you from what you could become. And it begins. Here to one, you confuse intensity with meaning. Think about it. Why do the sharpest moments, arguments, heartbreaks, disappointments, feel more real than calm ones? Why does chaos feel alive while peace feels suspicious? This is one of suffering's first consequences. It teaches you to equate emotional pain with significance. A simple moment of happiness, you doubt it. A stable relationship, you sabotage it. Quiet day with no crisis, you feel restless, incomplete. Your nervous system is so attuned to discomfort that the absence of it feels like a void. And the void terrifies you more than pain. The result: you gravitate toward what hurts because it feels familiar. You push away what heals because it feels foreign too. You sabotage opportunities without realizing why. This is where psychology and neurology merge into a dark dance. If your brain has been conditioned to expect suffering, any deviation from that pattern, chance at success, love, freedom feels like a threat. You might consciously want these things, but deep inside, the primitive mind sounds the alarm. This is unfamiliar. Turn back. So you do. You delay. You overthink. You freeze. You self-criticize until you're paralyzed. You say you're not ready, you say? Maybe later, but later never comes. Because your mind is just trying to return you to the emotional environment it understands. 3. You attract relationships that reflect your internal chaos. The world doesn't give you what you deserve. It gives you what you accept. You accept what you're accustomed to. If suffering has been your emotional baseline, you will unconsciously gravitate toward people who reinforce it, partners who are inconsistent, friends who drain you, mentors who belittle you, environments that mirror your internal wounds. This is not madness. This is a psychological law. The mind pursues equilibrium. Even when equilibrium is destructive, healthy relationships might overwhelm you. Kindness might feel uncomfortable. Genuine affection might make you suspicious. Instead, you feel magnetically drawn to emotional instability, not because you want the pain, but because you understand it. Point 4. Your identity becomes built on struggle instead of possibility. Here lies one of the most devastating unseen consequences. Suffering becomes your narrative. It becomes your explanation for who you are. You say things like, "I've always been this way. This is just my luck. This is how life is. I'm used to it." Over time, this narrative becomes armor-heavy, suffocating armor. You believe you're protecting yourself, but really, you're imprisoning yourself within an identity built on scarcity and hurt. And as this identity solidifies, everything in your life organizes around it. You underestimate your abilities. You expect disappointment. You choose the path you think you deserve, never the path you desire. 5. Your perception of the future becomes distorted. Human beings don't see the future based on facts. They see it through their emotional conditioning. If you've been conditioned to suffer, you unconsciously anticipate more suffering ahead. So when opportunities arise, your mind whispers, "It won't last. It's too good to be true. Something will go wrong." This cynicism feels like realism because you've forgotten what genuine optimism feels like. You see danger where others see possibility. You see obstacles where others see steps. You see risk where others see growth. This is how suffering protects its territory, by convincing you that hope is a delusion. 6. Your emotional world becomes narrow and predictable. When suffering becomes habitual, your emotional palette shrinks. You become fluent in excitable, stupefying. You lose fluency in joyous, second entrant, because you're incapable of these emotions, or because your psyche hasn't practiced them. Neurologically, emotions are pathways, and unused pathways deteriorate. The consequence? You feel emotionally stuck, not because life is cruel, but because your emotional vocabulary has withered from disuse. 7. You lose the ability to imagine a life beyond your wounds. The final consequence is the saddest one. Suffering steals your imagination. It restricts your vision to what you already know, limits your dreams to what feels safe. It convinces you that what lies ahead can only be a repetition of what lies behind. You stop dreaming boldly. You stop taking risks. You stop believing. In transformation, you survive, but you no longer live. And yet, beneath all these consequences, beneath all the conditioning and neurological grooves, one truth pulses like a faint heartbeat. You were not meant to spend your life repeating the emotions of your past, but to break free, you must do something unthinkable. You must rebel, not against society, not against others, not even against the world. You must rebel against the inner architecture that suffering built within you. Because the next step is not understanding, it is a revolution. You stand before an invisible threshold. Behind you, the familiar weight of suffering, its patterns, its narratives, its false promises of safety. Ahead of you, something uncertain, something formless, something that feels both dangerous and necessary. This is where the rebellion begins. Not with a burst of inspiration, not with a triumphant realization, but with a quiet, trembling refusal. A refusal to continue living inside the emotional architecture you inherited. A refusal to obey the internal gravity that keeps pulling you back to pain. A refusal to let your past dictate the limits of your future. Because the truth is, escaping suffering does not begin with action. It begins with defiance, a psychological insurgency, a revolt of awareness, and it starts with one radical idea that the world rarely teaches. You too won. You are allowed to question your pain. You are not obligated to honor every fear your mind produces. You are not required to obey every story your suffering tells. Most people assume their pain is the ultimate authority. If something hurts, it must be true. If something scares you, it must be avoided. If something feels uncomfortable, it must be dangerous. But suffering is not truth. Suffering is conditioning. So the rebellion begins the moment you pause and ask, is this pain actually protecting me or just repeating me? This simple question cracks the walls of the labyrinth, because suffering loses its power when you interrogate it. It cannot survive consciousness. It thrives only in autopilot. The moment you witness your suffering instead of becoming it, you reclaim the first piece of yourself too. You must learn to sit with unfamiliar emotions. Freedom does not feel good at first. It feels unsafe. People assume healing is warm, peaceful, calming, but real healing, the kind that restructures identity, is unsettling. It requires sitting with emotions that your brain has not been trained to feel. Stillness, joy, acceptance, safety, worthiness. These emotions feel foreign, not because they're wrong, but because they're new. And the human mind always interprets the unfamiliar as threatening. So breaking free means staying in those unfamiliar states long enough for your nervous system to adapt. Letting your body learn that peace is not a trap. Letting your mind learn that joy is not a countdown to disaster. Letting your heart learn that love does not have to be earned through suffering. This is emotional reconnection. Messy, fragile, and essential. 3. You must reclaim authorship of your internal narrative. For years, suffering has been writing your story for you, a story built on scarcity, fear, and inevitability. But the rebellion demands something terrifying. You must change the protagonist, not by becoming someone new, but by rediscovering who you were before suffering shaped your identity. Nietzsche believed that becoming who you truly are requires destroying the version of yourself that was shaped by external forces. It requires burning down the narratives that never belonged to you. Ask yourself, who would you be without your wounds? Would you be if you weren't trying to survive? Who would you be if you believed you were allowed to be whole? These questions ignite the rebellion, because the moment you imagine another version of yourself, you challenge suffering's monopoly on your identity. For you must confront the internal contracts you never signed. Every person carries its invisible rules. They live by rules they didn't create. Don't outgrow your family's suffering. Don't be happier than the people around you. Don't break patterns that others depend on. Don't change it makes people uncomfortable. Don't hope too loudly. These rules are not yours. They were handed to you through culture, upbringing, trauma, and observation. The rebellion requires breaking them one by one, not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of necessity. Because those contracts keep you loyal to a version of yourself that never had a choice. Point 5. You must disrupt your own psychological patterns. Rebellion is not a grand gesture. It is the daily act of choosing differently, even when every part of you wants to return to the familiar. Example, your instinct, isolate. Your rebellion, reach out. Your instinct, self-criticize. Your rebellion, observe without judgment. Your instinct, assume the worst. Your rebellion, pause before imagining the worst. Your instinct, stay where suffering feels safe. Your rebellion, walk toward the unknown anyway. Rebellion is choosing discomfort over repetition. It is choosing possibility over predictability. It is choosing truth over habit. 6. You must embrace micro-freedom. Freedom does not arrive in a single moment of revelation. It arrives in fragments, small, almost invisible victories that accumulate over time. One moment of emotional regulation, one boundary you uphold, one negative thought you do not indulge, one dream you allow yourself to say out loud. Micro-freedom rewires the nervous system. Micro-freedom reshapes identity. Micro-freedom teaches your mind that life does not collapse when suffering loosens its grip. The rebellion is a slow, deliberate transformation, not a miracle, but a practice. 7. You must give yourself permission to evolve. This is the hardest rebellion of all, because suffering convinces you that you must stay the same. That change would betray your past. That healing would invalidate what you've endured. That joy would make you naive. That hope would make you foolish. But Viktor Frankl wrote that human beings are not defined by their circumstances. They are defined by their response to them. You are not the events that broke you. You are the choices you make after. And the choice before you now is this: remain loyal to your suffering or become loyal to your becoming. And once you choose the latter, even trembling, even uncertain, you step into a new kind of existence. A life not built on repetition, but on conscious creation. But the rebellion is not the end, it's the doorway. Beyond it lies the final, most profound revelation. The truth that changes everything. You stand at the heart of the labyrinth, the place where every path converges, where every psychological pattern, every philosophical insight, every inherited wound has been leading you. The air here is different, still, heavy with a truth so simple, so profound, that it almost feels uncomfortable to hold. You've traced the roots of your suffering. You've witnessed its consequences. You've begun the rebellion, and now you're ready for the revelation that makes sense of everything. The truth is this: you were never addicted to suffering. You were addicted to who you believed you were, inside your suffering. Because suffering is not merely pain, it is identity. It is continuity. It is the emotional terrain your mind learned to navigate. Long before you had the power to choose differently, people don't cling to suffering because they enjoy it. People cling to suffering because it tells them a story they understand, a story they've rehearsed, a story that feels like home even when it hurts. But beneath that story lies an even deeper truth. One far more liberating and far more terrifying. You are not the pain you survived. You are not the patterns you repeated. You are not the emotional inheritance you never asked for. You are not the self you became when you didn't. No, you had options. You are the awareness that sees all of it, and awareness cannot be damaged. Awareness cannot be broken. Awareness is not defined by past conditions. Awareness remains untouched, watching, witnessing. Evolving this realization is the true revolution, far beyond the rebellion, because the moment you understand that your suffering is not you, and never was, you awaken to the possibility of becoming someone entirely new. But new is not quite the right word. It is more accurate to say you awaken to who you would have become if suffering had not taught you to shrink. This is the ultimate truth, the one the labyrinth has been guarding. One, your suffering was a teacher, not a definition. Every wound taught you something: how to interpret the world, how to protect yourself, how to anticipate danger, how to survive. But the purpose of a teacher is not to keep you in the same lesson forever. The purpose of a teacher is to make themselves unnecessary, and yet kept repeating those lessons long after the danger was gone. The realization here is subtle but transformative. You do not have to continue living in the emotional environment. Where your wounds were formed, you were allowed to graduate to the survival version. It's fine. Of you is not the whole you. There is a version of you that was crafted by necessity. The one who endured, the one who adapted, the one who stayed quiet, the one who learned to function while hurting. But that version of you was always provisional, created to keep you alive when you needed it most. Now comes the hard part. You must release the version of yourself that only knows how to survive, because survival is not living. Enduring is not thriving. Coping is not becoming three. Joy is not for joy. Just haven't practiced holding it. This truth often lands the hardest. Your brain learned to grip suffering tightly because it believed suffering was predictable, reliable, sturdy. Meanwhile, joy felt flimsy, like something the universe could snatch away at any moment. But joy is not fragile. Your familiarity with joy is fragile. Joy expands when held. Joy stabilizes when practiced. Joy deepens when accepted. In the moment you realize this, a new possibility emerges. You can build a life not from the residue of your wounds, but from the architecture of your potential. Point 4. You were never meant to fit inside the story suffering wrote for you. The narrative that shaped your past is too small for your future. The voice that kept you trapped was never your own. The limits you believed in were inherited, not inherent. And now, standing in the center of the labyrinth, you finally see it. Suffering was the tight skin you outgrew. The chrysalis you've been pressing against. Old identity is cracking under the weight of who you are becoming. You were not meant to live inside that shell. You were meant to emerge from it. Point 5. You are allowed to redefine reality. Here lies the deepest freedom of all. You are not responsible for the story you were born into, but you are responsible for the story you choose next. And choosing is an act of creation. A philosophical declaration. Psychological emancipation. You can choose to no longer see yourself as broken, to no longer interpret peace as danger, to no longer return to patterns that shrink you, to no longer perform the identity suffering carved into your bones. You can choose to be authored by possibility instead of pain. ****6. And finally, the most powerful truth, the one that dismantles the entire architecture of suffering. ****. You do not heal by fighting what you were. You heal by remembering who you are. Because beneath the layers of conditioning, beneath the neural grooves of habit, beneath the echoes of past wounds, there exists a you untouched by suffering. A you who has always been here, quiet, patient, waiting, a self-defined, not by pain, but by potential. Not by fear, but by freedom. Not by survival, but by emergence. You are not here to repeat the emotional memories of your past. You are here to expand beyond them. The labyrinth was never a prison. It was a passage. A journey inward so you could finally see the truth that suffering obscured. You are larger than your wounds. You are deeper than your fears. You are more expansive than your history. And now that you've seen this, now that the walls have opened, now that the old stories have cracked in your hands, there's only one question left. What will you build with the freedom you just reclaimed? Because your life is no longer a battleground. It is a blank page. And for the first time, you are the one holding the pen.